The roar of jet engines echoed through the luxurious first-class cabin, where the world's most powerful moguls relaxed with glasses of champagne. But in an instant, the serene atmosphere was shattered by an unexpected act. A pilot with a disdainful look struck a black female billionaire right in front of dozens of passengers. Who could have imagined that just 2 minutes later, this arrogant man would be on his knees, begging for forgiveness? This is not just a story about power and discrimination, but also a valuable lesson about justice. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. Share your city or country in the comments section. If you enjoy emotional and meaningful stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow, we'll bring you another inspiring story, made just for you. The story begins. The hum of the jet engines outside provided a steady backdrop to the tranquil silence of the first-class cabin. It was an oasis of plush leather seats, exquisite crystal glasses shimmering under the soft lighting, and well-dressed passengers skimming through their devices or sipping champagne. This was a world designed for comfort, exclusivity, and unspoken privilege. Maya Jackson stepped into the cabin, her figure momentarily silhouetted against the bright gold light pouring in from the jet bridge. She paused, her eyes, betraying the weariness of a long day, scanning the impeccable rows of seats. In her simple gray coat and worn flats, she was an enigma amidst the polished setting. A subtle shift rippled through the cabin. Passengers who had barely glanced at others now eyed her with a mix of curiosity and something more sharp. Maya, a self-made billionaire renowned for her transformative work in the field of renewable energy, carried herself with an understated elegance. Her dark skin glowed under the cabin lights, her naturally curly hair framing her face with an effortless beauty. Yet despite the power she wielded in the boardroom, her unassuming demeanor often confounded those who expected arrogance from someone of her stature. Ashley, a veteran flight attendant with her crisp uniform and practiced smile, stood near the galley. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly as she took in Maya. Something about Maya's presence, the contrast between her simple attire and her seat assignment, seemed to unsettle her. Ashley approached with a deliberate step, her heels clicking softly on the carpeted aisle. "Good evening," she said, her voice a touch too high. The politeness was practiced, not genuine. "Can I help you find your seat?" Maya glanced at the seat number on her boarding pass, then back at the plush window seat she had nearly reached. "No, thank you," she replied gently, her voice steady but kind. She placed her unassuming tote bag in the overhead compartment and slid gracefully into her seat. Ashley lingered, her smile faltering slightly. Her gaze flickered over Maya's bag, then to the worn cuffs of her coat. "Are you sure this is your seat, ma'am?" she pressed, her tone smooth but laced with thinly veiled doubt. "Perhaps I could double-check for you." Maya straightened slightly, meeting Ashley's eyes with calm authority. "I'm quite certain," she said, extending her boarding pass with a steady hand. "Would you like to confirm?" The moment stretched as Ashley accepted the pass, her fingers lingering on the paper longer than necessary. She examined it with a scrutiny that would have been laughable in other circumstances. Around them, the atmosphere of the cabin seemed to shift. Nearby passengers shifted in their seats, some feigning disinterest while others glanced with open curiosity. "Of course," Ashley said finally, returning the pass. Her smile was back, but the warmth had evaporated. "If there's anything else you need, please let me know." "Thank you," Maya responded calmly, her voice giving no hint of the unease or offense she felt. She settled back in her seat, her hand briefly caressing the armrest as she pulled a slim hardcover book from her bag. She opened it and let her eyes fall on the words, but the words swam before her, despite her composed posture. A flicker of unease had crept into her chest, subtle but undeniable. From the corner of her eye, Maya caught the gaze of a passenger 2 rows away, a middle-aged man in a tailored navy suit. He held her gaze for a beat too long before looking away, his expression unreadable, yet heavy with something unspoken. Maya forced herself to focus on her book, her thumb methodically flipping the edges of the pages as if the mere action could restore her composure. Ashley returned to the galley, her brisk steps echoing softly. She exchanged a look with another flight attendant, a young man who was adjusting a tray of glasses. "Interesting passenger today," she murmured under her breath, her lips barely moving. The man raised an eyebrow but didn't reply, focusing instead on his task. Ashley's gaze flickered back towards Maya, a shadow of something unspoken crossing her face. Unaware of the whispers and glances, Maya turned a page in her book. Her mind, however, had begun to register the subtle cues around her. The excessive politeness that felt like a dismissal, the surreptitious looks that followed her, the way Ashley's voice wavered when she said ma'am. She had seen it before countless times in boardrooms and boutiques, at charity galas, and now here in the rarefied air of first class. It wasn't new, but it was no less wearying. The cabin hummed with the quiet murmur of settling passengers. Maya adjusted her coat collar and opened her book, but the weight of Ashley's gaze was impossible to ignore. She flipped a page, feigning focus on the text even as the flight attendant's presence loomed at the edge of her vision. Ashley stood near the galley, pretending to adjust something on the service cart while glancing in Maya's direction. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she were waiting for an opportunity. It wasn't long before Ashley approached again, her polished flats making no sound on the carpet. She stopped in the aisle, a stiff smile plastered on her face. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice dripping with exaggerated politeness. "I need to confirm your seat assignment once more." Maya looked up, her fingers tightening slightly on the book's spine. She met Ashley's eyes calmly. "You've already checked my ticket," she said, her tone steady but firm. "Yes, of course," Ashley replied, her smile becoming more strained. "But there have been some changes. We occasionally have booking errors, especially with upgrades." Her emphasis on the word upgrades was subtle but unmistakable. "It's just a formality." Maya placed her book down carefully, her movements deliberate. The room around her seemed to fade into the background as she retrieved her ticket from her bag. She extended it to Ashley, her expression composed despite the frustration simmering beneath her skin. Ashley took the ticket and examined it as if it held a secret code that only she could decipher. Her manicured nails traced the printed details, her eyes narrowing slightly. "HM," she murmured, flipping it over unnecessarily. "Sometimes the system assigns first-class seats in error. It's rare, but it happens." The cabin had grown quieter. Maya could feel the weight of other passengers' glances. A man across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, glancing between his tablet and the unfolding scene. Two women further back exchanged furtive looks, their expressions unreadable. Maya watched Ashley's performance, each passing second a test of her patience. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm but carried an edge of steel. "That ticket," she said, "is valid. This is my seat." Ashley's lips pressed into a thin line. "Of course, ma'am," she said, returning the ticket with a touch of reluctance. "It's just that we try to ensure our first-class experience is seamless. You understand?" Maya folded the ticket, tucking it into her bag. "I understand," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "I also understand that you've checked this twice now. If there's a genuine issue, perhaps you should escalate it to someone else." Ashley blinked, her carefully crafted mask slipping for a moment. Her tone turned cool as she straightened, her hands clasped primly in front of her. "There's no need for escalation, ma'am. We'll handle this right here." The tension in the air felt almost palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Maya leaned back in her seat, her posture controlled, but inside, a familiar weariness gnawed at her. She thought of boardrooms where she had been talked over, business deals where her competence had been questioned until she proved herself tenfold. This was no different. The arena had changed, but the battle remained the same. The soft rustle of passengers adjusting their positions brought Maya back to the present. She glanced out the window, her reflection staring back at her from the slightly clouded glass. She wondered what would it take to stop having to prove that she belonged. Ashley remained there, her presence a persistent reminder of the unspoken accusation that hung in the air. After a pause, she spoke. "Sometimes our system misallocates seats. Perhaps it was a simple glitch." Her words were polite, but the underlying tone was sharp enough to sting. Maya's resolve hardened. She leaned forward slightly, meeting Ashley's eyes directly. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice soft but firm, the cadence of her words measured like a carefully honed blade. "I paid for this seat, and I have no intention of moving." The calmness, the defiance in her words seemed to momentarily disarm Ashley. The flight attendant hesitated, glancing around as if searching for support. The silent passengers offered no refuge. With a stiff nod, Ashley muttered, "Very well, ma'am," and retreated towards the galley. Maya exhaled softly, her fingers curling around the armrest. The cabin began to stir back to life, the awkward silence giving way to the murmur of conversations and the rustling of belongings. But she could still feel the lingering stares, the invisible weight of unspoken judgments. The soft click of the cockpit door opening echoed through the cabin like a warning shot. Maya didn't look up immediately. She smoothed the lapels of her coat, the slow, deliberate gesture a mask for the tension coiling in her chest. As the heavy footsteps approached, the sound measured and precise, she finally raised her gaze. The man standing before her was tall, his figure accentuated by the crisp, imposing lines of his uniform. The silver hair at his temples and the sharp set of his jawline seemed as if they were carved from granite. His presence carried the weight of command, a silent declaration that he was accustomed to having the final say. The gold bars on his shoulders gleamed under the soft cabin lights. "Captain Robert Marks," he said. "Is there a problem here?" Robert's voice was cool, almost rehearsed. Maya straightened in her seat, her composure refusing to waver. "I believe Ashley was just resolving it," she replied, her tone measured. Ashley emerged from behind him, her expression triumphant and smug. "Captain," she began, her voice dripping with false professionalism, "there seems to have been some confusion about seating. This passenger is in her assigned seat." Maya interjected, neatly slicing through Ashley's explanation. She turned her gaze directly to Robert. "I presented my ticket twice. It's valid. There is no confusion." Robert's eyes narrowed, sweeping over Maya with a detached scrutiny that felt colder than Ashley's disdain. His gaze lingered on her coat, her unassuming bag, and finally her face, as if searching for something he could challenge. "Madam," he said, his tone clipped, "we've had some issues with our reservation system lately. First-class seats don't usually," he paused, but the implication hung in the air, "don't usually belong to people like you." Maya's jaw tightened. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm but firm. "Perhaps the system has its flaws," she said, "but not this time. This is my seat, and I've made that clear." The cabin fell into an almost eerie silence. Maya caught the faint rustle of someone shifting in their seat, the soft creak of leather under a passenger's grip. She could feel their unease, their collective decision to become spectators rather than participants. Robert exhaled sharply through his nose, his patience wearing thin. "You're creating a disturbance," he said, his tone turning sharp. Maya leaned forward slightly, her hands resting lightly on her thighs. "I'm sitting in the seat I paid for. If that's disruptive, perhaps you should reconsider how you define order." Her calmness was like flint against steel, and it was clear that Robert felt the spark. His expression darkened. "I'll ask you one last time," he said, his voice low, the threat veiled but unmistakable. "Do you belong here?" Ashley's smug smile deepened, her confidence buoyed by the captain's further pressure on Maya. The undercurrent of racism, once subtle, now surged to the surface, carried by the sharp edge in Robert's question. Maya's fingers curled slightly, her nails pressing into her palms. The question was familiar, though its form often changed. In boardrooms, it was phrased in terms like, "Are you sure you're qualified for this project?" At social gatherings, it was conveyed through thinly veiled surprise. "You're the CEO? How extraordinary!" But here, in this confined cabin, it was bare and undisguised. Her voice was steady when she finally replied. "Yes," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "I do." The silence deepened, the tension in the air cracking like static before a storm. Robert's jaw tightened. His hand moved with swiftness, and before anyone could react, The sharp crack of his palm connecting with Maya's cheek shattered the quiet. The sound echoed through the cabin, leaving a hollow, deafening silence in its wake. Maya didn't flinch. Her head turned slightly to the side from the force of the slap, but she straightened immediately, her gaze unwavering. A red mark began to bloom on her cheek, stark against her skin. Her hand rose instinctively to touch it, but she paused mid-air, lowering it back to her lap. The other passengers were stunned, their eyes darting between Maya and Robert. Some looked horrified, others averted their gaze entirely, their discomfort palpable. Ashley took a small step back, her triumphant expression faltering into something akin to shock. Even she hadn't anticipated this. Robert stood rigid, breathing heavily, his face set as if he were justifying his actions even as he performed them. "You're disturbing the peace," he said, his voice devoid of remorse. "You'll need to leave this aircraft immediately." Maya remained seated, her composure unbroken. The slap was nothing compared to the weight of the moment, a weight she had carried in various forms throughout her life. Slowly, deliberately, she rose from her seat, her movements calm, her dignity intact. She turned to Robert, her eyes cold and resolute. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice steady and low, carrying an unspoken authority that silenced even Ashley. The captain didn't reply, but his face tightened, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. Maya retrieved her bag from the overhead compartment, her actions unhurried. She stepped into the aisle, walking past the rows of silent passengers who couldn't meet her eyes. Each step felt heavier than the last, yet she carried herself with the grace of someone who refused to be broken. The airport lounge buzzed with muted energy. Travelers moved through their own orbits of weariness and anticipation. Maya settled into a quiet corner, her posture as composed as ever, though her mind reeled with the weight of what had just transpired. The sting of Robert's slap still lingered on her cheek, but the deeper pain was harder to pinpoint, a mix of humiliation and the familiar burden of proving her place in a world determined to deny it. She sipped her water, her fingers lightly tapping against the glass as she replayed the confrontation in her mind. She had long learned how to mask her emotions, how to armor herself against the judgments and prejudices she had faced her entire life. But today, even her practiced resolve felt fragile. Across the lounge, a man in a simple black coat watched her silently. His eyes were sharp, missing nothing, though his demeanor was casual, blending seamlessly with the flow of travelers. He had been on the same flight, seated discreetly in economy class, observing the scene unfold with a calmness that belied his inner calculations. This was Marcus Clark, an undercover operative and trusted confidant within Maya's personal security detail. His presence on the flight had been precautionary. Maya's position and profile often necessitated quiet protection, even if she refused to acknowledge it. She valued her independence fiercely, and Marcus's job was to respect her boundaries as much as it was to ensure her safety. Today, he had done more observing than acting, knowing that intervening too early could escalate the situation in ways that Maya wouldn't appreciate. But now, as she sat in the lounge, her shoulders tense with unspoken frustration, Marcus knew it was time to act. He rose, pulling his phone from his pocket. As he moved to a more private area near the exit, the line buzzed only once before a crisp, efficient voice answered. "Yeah, it's Clark," Marcus said, his voice low but steady. "We have a situation." There was a pause on the other end, the kind of silence that spoke of rapid calculations. "Details? Incident on the flight. Captain and a flight attendant, Ashley I think, escalated a confrontation with Ms. Jackson. It got physical. She's okay, but it wasn't pretty." The voice on the other end hardened, each word measured. "How bad?" "Public humiliation, blatant discrimination, and a slap from the captain. It's not just a matter of image. It's systemic," Marcus replied, his tone calm but with an undercurrent of barely suppressed anger. "This wasn't an isolated incident. It ran deeper. You know how she'll want to handle it." The fluorescent lights of the terminal hummed softly, illuminating rows of sterile seating and worn carpeting. Maya pulled out her phone, scrolling absently, though the world on her screen blurred and meaningless. The slap still echoed in her mind, not just the sound but the collective silence that had followed. The slap was just Robert's hand on her face. It was the weight of centuries, a blow delivered by history. Maya rubbed her temples, trying to think clearly. She wouldn't cry, not here, not now. Tears would only serve as a release she hadn't earned. Passengers walked by, some casting quick, awkward glances in her direction. One woman hesitated, her mouth half open as if she might say something, but she didn't. Instead, she clutched her carry-on tighter and hurried towards her gate. Maya's eyes drifted to her reflection in the terminal window. The faint red mark on her cheek was visible, a testament to the physical pain. It was the deep, bone-weary exhaustion of having to live through moments like this over and over. She thought back to her childhood, to the first time she was asked, "What are you doing here?" The words had come from a teacher, her tone clipped and incredulous as Maya stood at the front of the class with a perfect score in a math competition. She had smiled then, polite and composed, as if the question wasn't a dagger aimed at her confidence. She thought of boardrooms where she had sat as a young entrepreneur, her innovative ideas dismissed until they were echoed by someone else. She remembered the raised eyebrows in upscale stores, the way salespeople lingered a little too close, their smiles a little too strained. This moment on the plane, it wasn't new, but it still burned. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. Maya straightened, taking a deep breath as she answered. "Elaine," she said, her voice clipped but steady. Elaine, her chief legal counsel, answered with immediate concern. "Maya, are you all right? I heard about—" "I'm fine," Maya interrupted, though her tone carried a steely edge that suggested otherwise. "We have work to do." There was a pause on the other end. Elaine had known Maya long enough to recognize this tone, the one that meant she was shifting from wounded to resolute. "What do you need?" Elaine asked. "Initiate a formal investigation," Maya said, her words precise. "I want every detail documented, passenger statements, flight logs, everything. This isn't just about what happened to me." She glanced out the window, watching a plane taxi down the runway, its lights blinking softly into the distance. "This is systemic. We need to expose it." Elaine didn't hesitate. "Consider it done." "Anything else?" "Yes," Maya replied, her voice turning colder. "Contact the airline's board of directors. I want the CEO informed, not tomorrow, but tonight." Maya ended the call and leaned back, the phone resting loosely in her hand. Her anger, sharp and unyielding, a moment before was already morphing into something more considered. She didn't just want justice for herself. She wanted change. As she sat in the quiet corner of the terminal, her mind began to map out the steps ahead. This wasn't just about Robert or Ashley, or even this airline. It was about dismantling the culture that allowed people like them to act with impunity. Maya took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the edge of her bag as she pulled out a notepad. The first page was blank, a clean slate waiting to be filled. She uncapped her pen and began to write, the ink flowing onto the page as her thoughts sharpened into action. Primary objectives: internal investigation. Ensure a thorough review of the airline's protocols and conduct, starting with this incident. Policy reform. Push for mandatory anti-discrimination training for all personnel. Accountability measures. Establish a system to review and address passenger complaints transparently. The list grew longer as she wrote, each bullet point a small but significant step towards the systemic change she envisioned. Her resolve settled into place, the sting on her cheek fading into the background. This wasn't the first time she had faced injustice, and it wouldn't be the last. But this time, she had the power, not just of her position but of her voice, her network, and her relentless determination. Maya set the notepad aside, her gaze shifting back to the window. Another plane took off into the night sky, its lights a faint glimmer in the darkness. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what had happened, but only for a moment, because there was work to be done, and Maya Jackson had never backed down from a fight. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of Maya's corner office as her legal and management teams gathered. The air in the room was thick, a mix of urgency and quiet anger. Elaine stood at the head of the table, her laptop open and a growing list of tasks projected onto the screen. Priority, Elaine said, her voice firm but steady, is securing passenger statements. We need their accounts to corroborate what happened. Maya, do you know if anyone attempted to intervene? Maya leaned back in her chair, her expression distant but sharp. No one spoke up, she said after a moment, but that doesn't mean they weren't watching. Elaine nodded. We'll start with those seated nearby. Security footage from the terminal might also help us piece together the moments after you left the plane. We've sent a formal request to the airline for the flight logs and cockpit recordings. Good, Maya replied, and make sure we look beyond this flight. I want to know if similar incidents have occurred, complaints filed and dismissed, patterns in how they treat passengers of color. The room fell silent as the gravity of her words sank in. This wasn't just about Robert or Ashley. It was about exposing a culture that allowed such behavior to fester unchecked. In the airline's break room, Ashley sat rigidly in a plastic chair, her hands clasped tightly around a mug of lukewarm coffee. But she barely took a sip. Across from her, two colleagues exchanged uneasy glances. I'm just saying, Ashley began, her voice defensive. We have standards in first class. It's not personal. You've seen it yourself, haven't you? When people don't quite fit the usual profile. Her words trailed off, half-spoken and half-implied. The older of the two flight attendants, Carla, raised an eyebrow. What do you mean by usual profile, Ashley? Ashley hesitated for a moment, then regained her composure. I mean professionalism, presentation. There's an expectation. First class is about maintaining a certain atmosphere. Sarah leaned back, crossing her arms. And you think asking for her ticket 3 times maintained that atmosphere? Ashley's jaw tightened. I was following protocol, she snapped. We've had issues with fraud before, people sneaking into first class without paying. It's my job to make sure things run smoothly. The younger flight attendant shifted uncomfortably. I heard the passenger wasn't causing trouble, though. She was just sitting in her assigned seat. Ashley's lips thinned. Look, it's not my fault if someone feels out of place. Maybe if she had handled it differently. Handled it how? Sarah interrupted, her tone sharp. Ashley didn't answer. She stared into her coffee mug, the silence around her heavy with the judgment she didn't want to acknowledge. Meanwhile, Captain Robert Marks sat in a small conference room on the other side of the terminal. The airline's HR representative adjusted her glasses, her posture stiff as she prepared to question him. You've been informed of the investigation, Captain, she began, her tone neutral but professional. We'd like to hear your account of what happened. Robert crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair. It's all being blown out of proportion, he said dismissively. That passenger was disruptive. I took the necessary steps to maintain order. Disruptive how? She refused to comply with the crew's requests, Robert replied, his tone laced with disdain. Ashley told me she was making a scene about her seat. I intervened to de-escalate, and slapping her was part of your de-escalation? Robert's jaw tightened. It was a split-second decision. She was being belligerent. Sometimes firmness is needed to assert authority. The HR representative frowned, making notes on her tablet. Passengers described her as calm throughout the exchange. Some even said she was composed as she left the aircraft. Are you sure your reaction was proportionate? Robert scoffed. Passengers only see part of the picture. It's easy for them to judge from the sidelines. The HR representative leaned forward. You don't seem to grasp the gravity of this situation, Captain Marks. A physical altercation with a passenger, especially under these circumstances, is unacceptable. I've worked for this airline for 20 years, Robert said coldly. I know what's acceptable. The HR representative met his eyes but didn't reply. As Maya's team conducted their interviews, a complex picture began to emerge. I saw the whole thing, one man admitted reluctantly. The captain, he slapped her. It was shocking, but I mean, she didn't even yell or anything. She just stood her ground. A middle-aged woman offered a different perspective. I don't know. It was uncomfortable for sure, but she seemed very insistent. Maybe if she had explained herself better, it wouldn't have escalated. Others shied away from the topic altogether. I didn't really see much, one businessman said, avoiding eye contact. I was working on my laptop, but not everyone was silent. A young woman seated nearby spoke up passionately. She did nothing wrong, she said. The flight attendant was dismissive from the start, and the slap was completely uncalled for. I've never seen such disrespect. Elaine sorted through the growing pile of testimonies and evidence. Her focus was sharp. There's enough here, she told Maya in a late-night call. The witness statements, the pattern of past complaints, even the way Ashley and Robert are justifying their actions. It all points to systemic issues. Maya listened quietly, her mind racing. The case was taking shape, but this was only the beginning. She knew that dismantling a deeply entrenched culture of bias would take more than evidence. It would require persistence, strategy, and a willingness to confront whatever resistance lay ahead. Keep going, she said. I want this airtight, no loopholes, no excuses. We're going to hold them accountable, and we're going to make sure this doesn't happen again. Elaine's voice carried a hint of admiration as she replied. Understood. Maya hung up the phone, her resolve unwavering. The fight was far from over, but she was ready for the next round. Morning sunlight cast long shadows across Maya's desk as she flipped through the increasingly thick file her team had compiled. Each page felt heavier than the last. A pattern was emerging, one that Maya recognized all too well. It wasn't just about one flight or one crew. It was a systemic rot that had quietly seeped into the airline. Here's another one, Elaine said, placing a thick envelope on Maya's desk. A passenger complaint from last year, filed by a black family traveling to a funeral. They were separated into different rows because their original seats were given to another group at the gate. When they protested, they were told, "You should be grateful we're accommodating you at all." Maya's jaw tightened as she scanned the document. The language in the complaint was disturbingly familiar. The dismissive tone, the defensive responses, and the accusations of disruptive behavior when the family demanded their assigned seats. This isn't an isolated incident, Elaine continued. We've found at least a dozen similar cases in the past 2 years. Different crews, different routes, but the pattern is the same. And almost none of these complaints were properly addressed. Maya closed the file, pressing her palms flat on the desk. Her office was quiet, save for the faint hum of traffic outside. But her mind was a whirlwind of anger and determination. This isn't just about my case, she said. It's a culture that treats people like me as an exception or an intrusion. Elaine nodded. We're not just dealing with a PR problem. This is a structural failure. Maya took a deep breath. Then we're going to fix that structure. That evening, long after her team had gone home, Maya remained in her office. The city lights twinkled through the tall windows, their glow forming faint patterns on the polished hardwood floors. Her notebook lay open before her, half filled with ideas, but her pen rested motionless in her hand. Her mind drifted back to the early days of her career, her first pitch to investors where she walked in with a suit she couldn't quite afford, facing a room full of men who doubted whether she was the real CEO. She recalled the polite skepticism when she secured her first major contract. The way people would say you must have worked so hard to get here, their tone laced with surprise that she was here at all. And now, sitting in the corner office of her own company, she felt the same weight she had carried throughout her life. The responsibility to prove, time and time again, that she belonged, and to make it easier for those who would come after her. This fight wasn't just about her. It was about dismantling a system that thrived on exclusion and making space for voices that had been silenced for too long. Maya straightened in her chair, her resolve hardening. She picked up her pen and began to write again. The next morning, Maya convened her core team in the conference room. The walls were lined with notes and charts outlining the systemic issues they had uncovered. At the head of the table, Maya stood with quiet authority, her notebook open before her. We've seen enough to know this isn't just a personnel problem, she began. This is about culture, and culture doesn't change without leadership and accountability. Elaine stepped forward, clicking through a presentation on the screen. Our plan for reform has three main pillars, she said. First, mandatory anti-discrimination training, not just a one-time workshop, but an ongoing program with realistic scenarios and measurable outcomes. Second, Maya added, we're overhauling the complaint system. No more dismissing passenger concerns as isolated incidents. Every complaint will be documented, investigated, and resolved transparently. A younger team member raised their hand. What about incentives for employees to encourage the right behavior? Maya nodded. Good point. We'll introduce recognition programs for employees who embody the values we're instilling. But let's be clear, accountability is non-negotiable. If someone violates these standards, they face consequences, no exceptions. The room buzzed with quiet determination as they mapped out the next steps. As the meeting adjourned, Maya lingered in the conference room, staring at the wall of notes. Each line represented a story, a moment of pain, a failure to see someone's humanity. Elaine approached quietly. You know this won't be easy, she said. There will be pushback from employees, the public, even other executives. Maya turned to her, her expression resolute. I know, she said, but if we don't push, nothing will change. And if nothing changes, people like Robert will continue to think they can act with impunity. Ashley will continue to believe she's just upholding standards. Elaine nodded. Then let's make them see. Maya smiled faintly, the weight on her shoulders feeling a little lighter. Change wouldn't come overnight, but it would come, and she wouldn't stop until it did. As Maya walked to her car, she paused to look up at the night sky. The stars were faint in the city lights, but they were still there, steady, enduring, just like her resolve. The conference room was silent, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Ashley sat at the long table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her polished demeanor was beginning to crack, her fingers twitching nervously and her eyes darting towards the door every few seconds as if searching for an escape route. Across from her, two members of the airline's internal investigation team sat with calm but probing expressions. Miss Chambers, one of them began, his voice firm but measured, we've reviewed the passenger statements and your incident report. There are some inconsistencies. Would you like to explain why you asked to verify Ms. Jackson's ticket multiple times? Ashley swallowed hard. I was following protocol, she said quickly. We've had issues with passengers sneaking into first class. However, the investigator pressed. Multiple witnesses have stated that Ms. Jackson remained calm and cooperative throughout the interaction. Can you explain why you continued to question her even after her ticket was verified? Ashley hesitated. The words she wanted to say, she didn't look like she belonged, caught in her throat. Instead, she mumbled, I was just trying to do my job. To do what exactly? The investigator asked sharply, his pen pausing over his notepad. Ashley's silence spoke louder than any explanation she could have offered. In a separate room, Captain Robert Marks leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed and his expression resolute. Unlike Ashley, there were no visible cracks in his composure. If anything, he seemed even more defiant. I acted in the best interest of the flight, Robert said, his voice unwavering. The passenger was disruptive. I took appropriate action to maintain order. The lead investigator, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, raised an eyebrow. Appropriate action, Captain Marks? You physically assaulted a passenger who, by all accounts, was not yelling or resisting. Witnesses confirm she remained seated and calm. Robert's jaw tightened. Witnesses don't always understand the full context. In the heat of the moment, you make decisions to ensure safety and order. Safety and order, the investigator repeated, her tone sharp. Ms. Jackson posed no threat. What exactly were you trying to preserve? Robert didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the table. Finally, he said, I've worked for this airline for 20 years. I don't need a lecture on protocol. The investigator leaned forward, her voice turning cold. Perhaps it's time you got one. A week later, Ashley found herself in a small, nondescript conference room packed with other airline personnel. At the front, A facilitator stood beside a whiteboard covered with words like bias, inclusion, and accountability. Ashley shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The session began with stories, real-life accounts from passengers who had experienced discrimination while flying. A woman recounted being repeatedly asked if she was sure she belonged in business class. A man described the humiliation of being followed by airport security because of his appearance. The stories were raw, unfiltered, and deeply unsettling. Ashley listened, her defenses wavering as the narratives unfolded. She remembered Maya's calm, unwavering gaze as she stood her ground, the quiet strength that Ashley had mistaken for arrogance. A sense of guilt began to creep in, slow and unwelcome. Afterwards, the facilitator asked the group to reflect on their own biases. Think about the assumptions you've made, she said, how they've shaped your actions, even unintentionally. Bias isn't always overt. It's often subtle, but it's no less harmful. Ashley stared at the worksheet in front of her. For the first time, she allowed herself to admit the truth. She had treated Maya unfairly, not because of her behavior, but because of who she was, or rather, who Ashley thought she wasn't. Meanwhile, Maya observed the changes unfolding from a distance. Reports of the training sessions reached her desk, documenting the gradual shifts in the flight attendants' attitudes. Some employees resisted, but others, like Ashley, showed signs of genuine reflection and growth. When asked if she wanted to press charges against Robert, Maya paused. Her anger simmered, but she knew her mission extended beyond personal vengeance. I don't need to ruin him, she told Elaine. I need to make sure no one else is harmed by people like him. Her focus remained on systemic change. She met with the airline's leadership team, outlining her vision for long-term change. Continuous bias training, a transparent complaint system, and a culture of internal accountability. In one meeting, an executive hesitantly asked, "Do you really think people can change?" Maya's response was calm but resolute. I don't just think it, I've seen it. But change doesn't come without effort. It requires leadership, persistence, and sometimes forgiveness. As the weeks passed, the ripple effects of Maya's efforts became clear. Ashley, once defensive and self-assured, began to approach her work differently. She volunteered to mentor new hires, emphasizing the importance of respect and empathy. She even requested a private meeting with Maya. I want to apologize, Ashley said, her voice slightly trembling. I didn't realize, I never thought about how my actions. She trailed off, her words failing her. Maya watched her quietly. What matters is what you do now, she said simply. Change isn't about words. It's about actions. Ashley nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Thank you. I'll do better. Robert, on the other hand, faced disciplinary action. His refusal to acknowledge his wrongdoing made it clear that he had no place in the airline's new direction. His departure was a statement, a sign that the culture Maya was building had no room for arrogance or impunity. Maya stood by her office window one evening, watching the city lights flicker to life. The tide was turning, slowly but surely. There was still much work to be done, but for the first time, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow across Maya's office as she sat reviewing the latest reports from the airline. Her reforms were taking root, passengers sharing positive feedback and employees beginning to embrace the changes, tentatively but genuinely. Yet, her focus remained sharp. There was no room for complacency. A knock on the door broke her concentration. Come in, she said, folding the report closed. Ashley entered, her movements hesitant but deliberate. She was dressed impeccably, but the polished air of self-assurance she once carried had been replaced by something quieter, more vulnerable. Miss Jackson, Ashley began, her voice slightly wavering. Thank you for seeing me. Maya gestured towards the chair opposite her desk. Please sit down. Ashley sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a moment, she said nothing, as if searching for the right words. Finally, she took a breath and spoke. I wanted to offer a proper apology. Maya's expression remained neutral, but her eyes softened slightly. She said nothing, waiting for Ashley to continue. I've spent the past few weeks reflecting, Ashley said, her voice halting but sincere. The training sessions, the stories I heard, they opened my eyes to things I didn't want to see before. I was too quick to judge you that day, not because of anything you did, but because of my own assumptions, and I was wrong. Ashley's voice wavered, but she pressed on. I can't undo what I did, but I can learn from it. I can do better, I promise. Maya observed her for a moment, her gaze steady but kind. Admitting your mistakes is a good start, she said, but real change takes time and effort. It's what you do next that matters. Ashley nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I understand, and I'll prove it. Maya extended her hand. Then let's move forward. Ashley shook it, a relieved smile briefly flickering across her face. Robert's fate, in contrast, took a different turn. Despite numerous opportunities to address his actions, he remained defiant, clinging to the authority he believed shielded him. I stand by what I did, Robert told the review board during his final hearing, his tone cold, his jaw set. This was about maintaining order. If people can't follow instructions, they shouldn't be in first class or on the plane at all. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions hardening. One of them, a senior executive, leaned forward. Captain Marks, he said, your refusal to acknowledge the gravity of your actions leaves us no choice. Effective immediately, your employment with this airline is terminated. Robert's face tightened, but he said nothing. He rose from his seat and left the room without a word, the door slamming shut behind him. For Maya, the news of Robert's dismissal was both bittersweet. His downfall was a necessary consequence, but it also highlighted the deeper flaws within the system, a culture that had enabled his behavior for years. His departure was a step forward, but the work of dismantling that culture was far from over. As the weeks turned into months, the changes Maya had fought for began to permeate the airline. The complaint system was overhauled, creating a transparent process that encouraged accountability. Training sessions became a regular fixture, with employees reporting a greater awareness of their biases and a stronger commitment to inclusivity. Passengers, too, began to notice the difference. Minority travelers shared stories of being treated with respect and dignity, and incidents of discrimination significantly decreased. One day, a letter arrived at Maya's office from a young black woman who had recently flown with the airline. Dear Ms. Jackson, the letter read, I just wanted to thank you. I was on a business trip last week, and for the first time I felt seen and respected. It may seem small, but it meant the world to me. Please keep fighting for people like me. Maya folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. It was a reminder of why this work mattered, not just to her, but to everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. One evening, Maya walked through the bustling headquarters of the airline. Employees greeted her warmly as she passed, their smiles genuine. She paused by a group of new hires gathered for a training session. Ashley stood at the front, speaking passionately about the importance of empathy and fairness in their work. Maya watched for a moment, a soft smile playing on her lips. Ashley had come a long way, and her growth was a testament to the fact that change, however difficult, was possible. As Maya left the building, the city lights twinkled above her. She felt the weight of the battles still ahead, but also the hope of what they had already accomplished. Change was slow and often painful, but it was worth it, and Maya Jackson was ready for whatever came next. The airline's main conference room buzzed with energy. Executives, flight crew, staff, and representatives from various advocacy groups filled the space, chatting over coffee and pastries. Maya stood near the back, observing the culmination of many months of tireless effort. On the projector screen behind her, a slide titled Fairness in Flight, Transforming Airline Culture shone in bold letters. This wasn't just a company presentation. It was a declaration of what they had achieved. Elaine approached, handing Maya a folder. The latest figures, she said with a smile. Discrimination-related complaints are down 75% since the reforms were implemented. Employee satisfaction is up 60%, and we've had 5 other airlines contact us to adopt our model. Maya flipped through the folder, nodding thoughtfully. This is just the beginning, she said, her voice calm but resolute. Elaine chuckled. When you say just the beginning, it usually means I'll need more coffee. Maya laughed softly, a rare sound these days. Perhaps, she said, closing the folder. The airline had become a case study in change. Mandatory anti-bias training had evolved from a compliance exercise to a point of employee pride. Stories of transformation, like Ashley's, inspired others to confront their own prejudices. Flight attendants shared their experiences in training videos, recounting how their perspectives had evolved. Passengers reported feeling genuinely cared for, not just served. And the leadership team, once skeptical of Maya's plans, now publicly championed them. At the quarterly press conference, the CEO stood beside Maya, telling a room full of reporters, Ms. Jackson's vision has reshaped not just our company, but the industry as a whole. He added, her insistence on accountability and inclusion has proven that doing the right thing is also good business. The applause that followed was a stark contrast to the resistance Maya had faced when she began her journey. Late one evening, Maya sat in her office, the city skyline stretching out before her. On her desk were two items: the folder of positive reports Elaine had given her, and a framed photo of herself as a young woman at her first office, a cramped space with peeling wallpaper and a second-hand desk. She picked up the photo, studying the determined expression on her younger face. Back then, she had dreamed of success not just for herself, but for what it would allow her to change. Now, sitting in the corner office of a transformed company, she realized she had achieved more than she had ever imagined. But the journey wasn't over. No scars, Maya murmured, tracing her fingers along the edge of the photo frame, remembering the moments that had tested her resolve. The slap on the plane, the deafening silence of the passengers, the countless microaggressions she had endured over the years. Each wound had shaped her, fueling her determination to ensure that others wouldn't have to fight the same battles. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her reverie. It was an email from a passenger, another thank you note. She smiled softly, the message reinforcing the quiet but powerful impact of her work. A few weeks later, Maya boarded a flight for the first time since the incident. She traveled without any fanfare, just a small bag and an air of quiet confidence. The first-class cabin was calm, the hum of the engine soothing as she settled into her seat. As the flight crew prepared for takeoff, Maya glanced around. Across the aisle, a young black woman sat with her laptop open, typing rapidly. She wore a tailored blazer, her hair was neatly styled, and her expression was focused. The woman looked up briefly and caught Maya's eye. She smiled, a small, confident smile, before returning to her work. Maya felt a surge of pride, a silent testament to the progress they had made. This wasn't just about her. It was about creating a world where people like that young woman could take their rightful place without question or hesitation. As the plane lifted off into the sky, Maya leaned back, the horizon expanding before her. There would be more battles ahead, there always were. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace. The fight wasn't over, but it was worth it. This story is a powerful reminder that justice always prevails, and no one can escape the consequences of their wrong actions. If you were in Serena's position, how would you react? Have you ever had to fight for the respect you deserve? Share your thoughts in the comments section. Your voice can inspire and create positive change. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to share it with your friends and loved ones to spread the message of fairness and courage. Thank you for watching and joining us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next emotional story. Wishing you strength, perseverance, and success. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe for the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared for the purpose of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any errors, please forgive with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.